American women in World War II. Women on the home front. World War II is often falsely identified as the first time that American women worked outside of the home in large numbers. In fact, about a quarter of the women worked outside of the home in 1940. Before World War II, however, women's paid labor was largely restricted to traditional female positions such as typing or sewing, and most women were expected to leave the labor force as soon as they had children, if not as soon as they were married. So during this day and age, women typically didn't really work when they were married or when they had kids, but they were in the workforce, however, in a very small section of the workforce that was just basically for women's work, typing, sewing, maybe a nurse, but really it was the man's job to do the work. But World War II changed both the type of the work the women did and how much work they did. 5 million women entered the workforce between 1940 and 1945. The gap in the labor force created by departing soldiers meant opportunities for women. In particular, World War II led many women to take jobs in defense plants and factories around the country. These jobs provided unprecedented opportunities to move into occupations previously thought of as exclusive to men, especially the aircraft industry, where a majority of workers were women by 1943. So during this time, men went off to war. So what women did is they had an opportunity now to take the man's role. They were allowed to have jobs that were typically men positions, like in with aircraft carriers and the defense industry. Before that time, it was very rare, if it perhaps it did not even happen, that women were in those specified areas. But the World War II changed everything for that. The challenges of wartime work. Working women, especially mothers, faced great challenges during World War II. To try to address the dual role of women workers and mothers, Eleanor Roosevelt urged her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to approve the first U.S. government child care facilities under the Community Facilities Act of 1942. Eventually, 7 centers servicing 105,000 children were built. The First Lady also urged industry leaders to build model child care facilities for their workers. Still, these efforts did not meet the full need for child care for working mothers. So with men being off at war, there was not an extra parent to take care of any kids that were around. So what the government had to do was create these child care facilities. And even though they were able to build and construct 7 centers, which took in about 105,000 children, they were not even able to be close to meet the demand that women needed. So women were really just taking over the workforce industry and taking care of the duties at the household as well. There were also some cultural resistance to women going to work in such male-dominated environments. In order to recruit women for factory jobs, the government created a propaganda campaign centered on a figure known as Rosie the Riveter. Rosie was tough yet feminine. To reassure men that the demands of war would not make women too masculine, some factories gave female employees lessons on how to apply makeup, and cosmetics were never rationed during the war. Keeping American women looking their best was believed to be important for morale. So women were looked at as these dainty housewives, that if they were to be working in a man's field, that would make them masculine. So the push was to keep that cultural norm of women being dainty and cute and pretty and made up, that these companies would give lessons on how to apply makeup and cosmetics. Any makeup was always available during the war. It was nothing that was ever rationed or hard to get. Minority women faced particular difficulties during the World War II era. African American women struggled to find jobs in the defense industry and found that white women were often willing to work beside them when they did. Although factory work allowed black women to escape labor as domestic servants for a time and earn better wages, most were fired after the war and forced to resume work as maids and cooks. Japanese American women in Western states had little access to new job opportunities, given that the policy of Japanese internment had resettled them in remote locations. So the issue with this was the bombing of Pearl Harbor was from Japan, so we created this divide and discrimination against Japanese American people, that we didn't have this trust for them anymore, and they weren't finding jobs for them was really hard. Cramped into converted barns, living with as many as 8 people in a single room, Japanese American women struggled to retain semblance of normalcy in the face of terrible privation. Women in war. Approximately 350,000 American women joined the military during World War II. They worked as nurses, drove trucks, repaired airplanes, and performed clerical work. Some were killed in combat or captured as prisoners of war. Over 1,600 female nurses received various decorations for courage under fire. And there's a picture of, there's actually the Women's Air Force. So these are service pilots that says they flew planes from factories to military bases. Those who joined the Women's Air Force service pilots flew planes from factories to military bases. Many women also flocked to work in a variety of civil service jobs. Others worked as chemists and engineers, developing weapons for the war. This included thousands of women who were recruited to work on Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb. Minority women, like minority men, served in the war effort as well, though the Navy did not allow black women into its ranks until 1944, so that's a year before the war ended. As the American military was still segregated for the majority of World War II, African American women served in black-only units. Black nurses were only permitted to attend to black soldiers. So even though we see during this time the country coming together to support one another, there's still this racial divide between white and blacks, and whites and Japanese Americans, and everyone else in the entire nation. So there's this huge divide in so many areas because of this racial segregation and discrimination. Women after the war. Social commentators worried that when men returned from military service, there would be no jobs available for them, and admonished women to return to their rightful place in the home as soon as victory was at hand. Although as many as 75% of women reported that they wanted to continue working after World War II, women were laid off in large numbers at the end of the war. But women's participation in the workforce bounced back relatively quickly. Despite the stereotype in the 1950s housewife, by 1950, about 32% of women were working outside the home, and of those, about half were married. World War II had solidified the notion that women were in the workforce to stay. So World War II really paved the way for women in the workforce and those opportunities that they had.